My name is Rob Dunn. I'm the CEO of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative. And in opening today's events, I'd like to acknowledge the traditional owners of this land and their elders past and present where we are meeting today. I would like to give a special welcome to the Minister for the Environment, the Honourable Rob Stokes MP, and our guest speaker, Harvey Locke, both of whom I know we're all looking forward to hear speak. The Great Eastern Ranges Initiative is a true partnership. It brings people and organisations together to share their ideas and experiences across diverse landscapes. Today is proof of that. So it is great that several members, for example, of the Australian Committee of the IUCN have come along. I always take the opportunity to thank Penny Figgis for her support for GER since its very beginning. And I'd also like to acknowledge the support of two other older statesmen, if I could call them that, of Great Eastern Ranges. Bob Debus, who actually invited Harvey to Australia and suggested the event today, and Brendan Mackey, who, along with many of his colleagues, have developed the science that underpins our work. But what has allowed the GER to expand in size, impact and reach is the support we receive from our 10 regional partnerships and 22 national and state NGOs, many of whom are represented here today. And I'd like to take special point of acknowledging the support of the staff of Office of Environment and Heritage and the National Parks and Wildlife Service. Great Eastern Ranges is a true public-private partnership, and your department's staff minister continue to be critical to our success. Harvey, I'd like to thank you for giving us your time today and for being a true inspiration to us for so many years. And Minister, before I ask you to speak and introduce Harvey to us, I'd like to thank you on behalf of the 180 organisations and many landowners for your government's generous support over many years. Indeed, it was in this very theatre that the announcement of 4.4 million in funding was made in late 2010. So this theatre has a special relevance to us. And this funding has been critical to our success. Put simply, the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative would not be where it is today without that support. I'd now invite you to make your address and invite Harvey to speak.
So as everyone would appreciate, the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative is a fabulous example of what the International Union for the Conservation of Nature calls connectivity conservation. And in the case of the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative, as Rob has already announced, it's something that the government of which I am part is proud to support in terms of the 4.4 million that we have provided of public funds to support this powerful initiative, which is breathtaking in its scope, connecting more than 3,600 kilometres right along the Great Dividing Range and encompassing up to 33 million hectares. So it's a vast and visionary and expansive vision of conservation, and it is one that is truly exciting to learn about and must be exciting for all of you who are involved to be part of. I just wanted to drift into an area of, I suppose, conservation philosophy for a moment, to, I suppose, provide some personal reflections of why I see the Great Eastern Ranges Initiative as so critical to developing a narrative of conservation that can capture the imagination of the public. We know when the conservation movement started out, really in its modern iteration in the sort of late 19th century, particularly in the United States, the focus was quite defensive. It was on parks and parks alone. And park actually comes from an old High German word meaning fence. So it was this idea of excluding and setting apart. That, of course, is a very important and powerful motivation, but the exciting thing about connectivity conservation is instead it's much more positive and almost aggressive in looking outside of parks to this vision of connecting. And we know from the human environment as well as the natural environment the importance of connections. As was once said, a kingdom divided against itself cannot stand, a house divided against itself will fall. It's the importance of connecting landscape that can maximise or almost quite dramatically the conservation outcomes. And so that's why the ethic behind this project and the whole idea of large landscape conservation is so exciting and so compelling and so visionary and so capable of capturing public imagination. And I suppose to conclude on this thought, something that I see in these early days of my role that I want to pursue. Obviously, my role is within government to be the principal advocate for conservation outcomes within the New South Wales Cabinet. That is a role that I take very, very seriously, and I'll wake up every day to do all I can to maximise the opportunities for conservation in our wonderful state. But as part of that, I see it as leading a conversation with communities about the benefits of conservation. And that is what is so inspiring about these sorts of projects, because it's changing the ethic, changing the way in which people look at land. This is something that I first read about in a quote that has stayed with me from Aldo Leopold's Sand County Almanac, the idea that we abuse land because we regard it as something belonging to us. When we see land as something to which we belong, then we're on the journey of treating it with love and respect. Ladies and gentlemen, might I welcome Harvey Locke to come and speak with us.
So this is thrilling for me to be among you. A funny thing about being a Canadian in Australia is you almost begin every conversation with some connection to Canada with an Australian. It's a very interesting thing, and I feel very at home in your country, and I recognize I'm a stranger, so I'm not here to tell you what to do. But I would like to share with you a global perspective on nature conservation as it's unfolding in the 21st century, and how it relates to society at large, and then to be specific about Australia. I have the good fortune of traveling around the world working on large landscape conservation and visiting great places, and this week Bob Debus and I actually were in Kakadu National Park, which is certainly one of the world's great parks. And it was very exciting for me because there's kind of a list of the A parks in the world, and Kakadu was on it. And had a very special time at Ubir looking at the rock art and the birds and everything. And it was very, very cool. So you have a wonderful country. So let me take you on a little journey from the Great Eastern Ranges to the world and perhaps back. I want to start with this image, which is a painting from the 19th century. This painting is called American Progress. And it's an interesting painting because it is the mental map that Anglo-Saxon people had in their head as they went out and settled New World places. So here is Liberty, and she's leaving the big cities in the East Coast, and in her hand is a telegraph line and a book of knowledge and the Star of Empire on her forehead. She's quite lovely, and you can see with her coming are trains, stagecoaches, there's miners, there's farmers with their plows, and before her flees, she's chasing out of the landscape the wolves, the Aboriginal people, and the bison. So out with the wild and in with the civilization. That's progress. And that's the mental narrative. It was very, very powerful in the 19th century. And if you fattened her up a little bit and you put a crabby expression on her face, of course, that's Queen Victoria. And it's exactly what happened in Australia. It's exactly what happened in Canada. It's exactly what happened in South Africa. And this is what progress is. Was extremely powerful, but it was not the only impulse. There was also another concurrent intellectual trend called Romanticism. And this was the idea that the world was beautiful when it was natural. And it was actually a counter-reaction to the Industrial Revolution and the hyper-rational sort of scientific clockwork view of the world. And that also exerted enormous power on people's imaginations. And those two things came together at a place called Yellowstone in the United States. And in Yellowstone, this enormous innovation occurred, the creation of the national park. And what was so special about it is that before that there had been King's hunting reserves, like the New Forest in England, which is the oldest park in the world, recently just made into a national park about 6 years ago, was set up by William the Conqueror as his private hunting reserve, and has been a protected area for 1,000 years. But this was the one that was done for the public and owned by the public. in the interest of the people. That was very special. And as the founder of Canada's Park Service, which was the world's first park service, said, it breathed the true spirit of democracy. So it's an idea as well as a place. And that idea spread like wildfire through the English-speaking world. Royal National Park in Australia, second in the world. Banff National Park in Canada, where I live, third national park in the world. Then you go Kruger, you go in New Zealand, there's parks, and so on. And by the rollover of the 20th century, so 1900, we've had national parks all over the English-speaking world except in England. And what's so important about that is it was perceived as a sort of a reconciliation of these values. We had green boxes on the landscape, and that's where we're saving nature. Or we might be trying to do it in wilderness areas, because wilderness areas also emerged as a kind of protected area at that time. And the true time we developed ecological reserves, and then we had public forests that we were managing sometimes for their benefits to nature. And we developed the sort of a model of a green box on the landscape. And the green box on the landscape, I want to say, has been fabulously successful. The park idea is, as somebody once said, the best idea America ever had. I could say even the best idea Western civilization ever had, because it represents us doing something for something other than ourselves. And it is also for future generations. And this is the thing that is magical about the park idea, and why at the World Parks Congress coming up in Sydney this November, we must celebrate this spectacular idea as one of the greatest things humanity has ever done. But we also know we must now do more. So I want to just share with you a global perspective on the effectiveness of parks to save nature. So this is a tiger in Bandhavgarh National Park in India. And India actually has a really good system of national parks. This is the range of tigers, historically and today, in the world. All of the yellow areas are where tigers were when Liberty and Queen Victoria set out on their journeys. Green dots are where they are now. And what those green dots mask is the dense populations are only concentrated in a few places. This is the densest tiger population in the world right here, in the Western Ghat Mountains of India. 500 tigers in one cluster of national parks. You want tigers, find the conservation reserves, the national parks, and you'll find tigers. And without those, the tiger population would have already disappeared from planet Earth. This is a close-up of the conservation reserves in India they call the tiger reserves. And the Indian government is really doing interesting things to keep them in the landscape. Lions. This is a lioness in the Masai Mara in Kenya, which is part of the Serengeti ecosystem. Lions distribution historically in red, lions current distribution in blue, and in fact, the density, again, if you do a density analysis, the lion populations that are doing well correspond to protected areas. So we must remember that the cornerstone, the building block, the foundation of all nature conservation is the national park or protected area managed explicitly for nature. And this becomes really important to remember when we look at sort of the state of the world today. You will learn from my talk that I am an optimist. I believe we can have a beautiful 21st century. But I'm also a realist, and we need to confront where we are. And this is a kind of a sobering assessment that anybody who's done a global assessment in the world comes up with and agrees with, that we are at risk of exceeding the resilience of our ecosystems in this century through a combination of climate change, land use change, pollution, and overexploitation of resources. And exceeding the resilience of ecosystems is bad for people, because one of the things that we tend to lose track of is that we are mammals, and there's three things we have to have that come from nature: food, air, and water. We don't know how to make food. It's really important. We know how to manipulate things to create bigger yields, We don't know how to make food. We don't have the recipe for food. Nature gives us food. We sure don't have the recipe for water, and we sure don't have the recipe for air. Those all come from the biodiversity's interactions in the world. That's what gives us the atmosphere, the food we eat, and the air we breathe. We need to remember that. So I want to take you on a little journey about the parks, as effective as they are, and how we need to think bigger than that now. So this is an interesting place. This is the Middlesex Fells Reservation in Boston. And Boston is an interesting place because it's one of the older cities in the United States. And this Middlesex Fells was set aside in the 1890s. And it was set aside explicitly to protect the wild values there, wilderness, particularly plants. I actually went into an archive when I lived in Boston and researched it, and it was waxing ecstatic about this wild area near the city and keeping the plants. Of course, what's happened in the 20th century is the city has completely surrounded it and turned it into an island. And what's fascinating about it is Boston's always had good universities for a very long time. You've probably heard of a couple of them. And one of those universities, a couple of scientists went in the 1890s and inventoried all the plant species because it was set up to protect plants. And there were 300 native plant species and about 17 exotics. And I don't need to tell Australians what exotics are. I know you're familiar with that. Then somebody had the idea to go in 100 years later, after it had been surrounded as an island, to see how it was doing. And it's been managed explicitly for conservation that whole time. It's a wonderful place. I spent time there when I lived in Boston. And what they found is that there were now only 230 native plants and 70 exotics. And what was disappearing from the system was plants like this, the bulb-reproducing plants. Because if they got sick or were dug up or something happened to them, they were now isolated from the rest of the landscape, and they would just literally drop out of the system. They would disappear. And the things that required animal transport, the burrs we call them, little seeds that stick to fur, were drying out because there was no fur transporting them anymore because there were no animals moving in and out of the system. And the things that were continuing to thrive, that were native, were pollinators because the air was still connected. So we learned that at that scale, something in the order of 1,200 acres is too small to maintain its ecological integrity through time as a park. It can't be divorced from the landscape at that scale. But what if we scale up and say, okay, well, that's a tiny place. This is Point Pelee National Park in southern Canada. It's a peninsula that extends into Lake Erie. It's the southernmost part of Canada. It's called the Carolinian Forest because it actually has a forest and climate like North Carolina, which surprises people from a Canadian point of view. It's a really important flyway for migratory birds, for monarch butterflies, and so on. And it was first an admiralty area, so it was a military reserve, so in that sense it was protected from access, and has been a national park for 100 years. And you can see that behind the flag and the gate there's forest, and in front of it you can see there's a lot of stuff going on, and in fact there's a bunch of tomato fields. It's very transformed. It's a very hard edge from forest to tomato field. And tomato fields are very heavily manipulated to maximize yield, land's drained, everything. This is what happened with species over time. Historically, mud puppies, salamanders, toads, all present in the system. 1972, 3 of them are gone. 1994, half of them are gone. And so one of the things I've learned talking to Australians is if I talk about tigers or elephants or grizzly bears or something, people say, well, we don't have any of those in Australia. You have these. And this is what happens when you isolate a population from its landscape context. And the reverse happens too if you don't think about landscape context, even if it's totally intact, and you have a park like Kakadu. If you let the cane toads hop in from Queensland, they cause havoc inside the park. So whether it's inside out or outside in, we have to think about parks in a landscape context. So these are the great park systems in North America, the really big ones, as well as the small ones. How do they do, really big ones, through time? The answer is they're spectacularly successful, big places. The bigger your park, the better off you are. This is carnivores and ungulates in North America historically and in the present. So historically means Liberty setting out, or Queen Victoria, and to the current day. And you can see where the colors are 14, colors are bright red. This is the historic map. There were animals all over the place. Buffalo, New York had buffalo. There were elk. There were wolves. There were grizzly bears way out here on the Great Plains. And you can see as you get more tropical, there's very low numbers that start green because in the tropics, big animals don't tend to occur. They tend to be more temperate. But you can see the distribution then. The Great Plains of North America were like the Serengeti in my family's, my ancestors' memory. The Great Plains were like the Serengeti in North America. Today, you can see it's gone white here. That means 0 of those species. So species with big antlers, big teeth, down to 0 because this is the big corn belts, cultivated belts in the center of North America. Down to 1 species or 2 in many, many places. But where those parks are, biggest concentration. I'll go back to show you that map of where the parks are. Look at that. Look at the current range. Pretty remarkable. They really work. And the system that I work on, and which a lot of you might have heard about, the Yellowstone-Yukon system, we have the most extensive series of conservation reserves in the world in the southern half of Yellowstone-Yukon. And strangely enough, that's where all of our native species are still found. But the challenge is that even them as islands won't make it through time. Whoops. So this Yellowstone Park here is actually an island of grizzly bears isolated from the population concentrated in these parts. And it will not make it through time unless it's reconnected at the landscape scale. And similarly, we risk fragmenting right through here if we don't do conscious work to keep it woven together. And it's kind of mind-boggling to think this big. But it's how big we have to think if we want nature to be there with us in the 21st century. In the past, we've been very, very lucky that as we developed, as we built these wonderful civilizations, as we built great cities like Sydney, we just assumed that nature was there and that we were struggling to create our civilization in a patch of nature. And now we've kind of flipped that, where nature will only be there in those places we permit it to be. And we have to be deliberate. Because if we don't permit nature to be, probably we don't permit our civilization to continue for very long, because we're wholly dependent on nature at the end of the day. But this is a weird place for a species to be. Nobody knows how to do what we're talking about. No civilization has ever been confronted with the challenges that we face in the 21st century. We don't have a roadmap from the past to look at because there's never been 7 billion people, and there's never been an industrial civilization at our scale before. And I like to think we're up to it, up to the task. But we have to focus on it clearly. And there is a community of people from all over the world who are asking this question. How can we live well in the 21st century? How can we keep nature functioning along with us? And this is from actually a gathering that I organized in the Canadian Rockies about 12 years ago that actually led to the creation of a book called Connectivity Conservation, a Global Guide that Graham Warboys is the lead editor of. And you can see actually Graham's in that photograph with your flag. And there's this community of people all over the world who want to do something together about this. And this is a family of some of the initiatives in the world that are moving ahead in this direction. And you are among the leading pioneers in the world on doing this stuff when you talk about the Great Eastern Ranges. You have pioneered also a new model. And I want to spend a bit of time on the conceptual framework about this, remembering that no one knows how to do large landscape conservation except for those of us who are trying to learn on the job. And I hope in 100 years from now, people will look back and say it's as obvious as the park idea. But when you're learning on the job, we have done Yellowstone to Yukon entirely without government support. It has been driven at a grassroots citizen level, but we also operate in an environment where there's an enormous amount of philanthropy, particularly in the United States. If we had to do it purely in Canada, there actually wouldn't have been the philanthropic base to support the idea. In Australia, in Great Eastern Ranges, it's actually the New South Wales government that has stepped up. And what's particularly exciting to me is that it has been a nonpartisan step up. That is really, really exciting, because then it's a cultural project. It's not a political project. And the most important thing about large landscape conservation, sometimes called connectivity conservation, is that it needs to be a shared social vision. And we need to also break away from the past way of doing environmental activities, where typically an environmental group would say, save the X, give me money, write letters that I ask you to write, support me to achieve this outcome. Large landscape conservation is about let us come together in service of a common vision to which each of us can contribute in our own way, but in service of a common goal. It's a very different way to organize your thinking. And done well, it allows the space for everyone to participate. And it becomes a nonpartisan activity. It becomes a cultural, societal activity. And I deeply believe that's the path of the future on environmental stuff, is how do we focus on what nature needs? And I'm going to use those words for a minute. In the past, we have assumed that there was this giant refrigerator of nature that we could just go in and raid and eat as much as we wanted, and it would always automatically refill itself somehow. And we take a look at how we've managed fisheries around the world. We just assumed that nature would make more, and then all of a sudden we have fisheries in collapse all over the world, because we actually hit a wall. The fridge actually is empty. So now we need to be thinking differently about, oh boy, where does this stuff come from that gets in the fridge? And that makes us think about what nature needs. What does nature need in order to generate the things that we depend on? And I did an article where I rolled up the science in an issue of Parks magazine, IUCN's Parks magazine last fall, called Nature Needs Half. And no matter where you go in the world, if you ask these questions, can we represent natural systems and their enduring features representatively, not all of them, but some of each kind, and all the native species be maintained in their natural patterns of abundance and distribution, and natural processes like flooding and fire, and then have resilience to things like climate change, how much of a given system do you need to protect? And the answer is invariably coming up around half, at least half, in an interconnected way. And then you say, okay, well, what does protect mean? And the IUCN has done some wonderful work on this through the World Commission on Protected Areas. In 2008, it issued a set of guidelines about what a protected area is after a very large global process that I spent a lot of time on, and people like Penny did too. And it's the idea that it's a place that's managed in an effective way explicitly for nature conservation that can provide other benefits too, but in the event of a conflict, nature comes first. And when you use that definition, the national park remains sort of the gold standard and an essential core building block, but it can also include, at a very important scale, traditionally conserved areas, indigenous areas. It can include landowners who want to manage their land in a careful way. It can include municipalities that have water catchments. It opens up the space to a whole variety of actors that each of them can contribute in different ways. Land trusts can start playing big roles by providing economic incentives to landowners to manage their places explicitly for nature and for their other benefits. And in this way, you can assemble things at that scale. And what's so interesting, if you look at the great blocks of the protected areas in the world that are famous for wildlife, and you look at how much of them are protected, the Serengeti Mara ecosystem, for example, over half of it is protected. It's no accident that that's the greatest concentration of African wildlife in the world. The Yellowstone to Yukon system in the southern half, we're somewhere around 40% protected. And we're working on stitching together the pieces that are missing. And what's neat about this is that by having some kind of a yardstick focused not on my campaign to tell you to do what on your land, but instead, what does nature need and how can I contribute to it? I believe we create a new space for us to come together as people. And we don't have to agree on a whole bunch of things, except that we have to agree that we all want nature to continue with us. And in such a setting, one of the things that's become out super clear is that rivers need natural process to do well. And that includes flooding. And the best thing we can do in a landscape is to keep intact river systems and fluvial processes. That's the single best thing we can do to enable nature to be resilient and adapt. Something in the order of 70% of all species in gravel bed river systems in North America that are in mountain environments will interact at some point in their annual life cycle with a river corridor. And I was with some tropical ecologists up in Darwin this week, and they said, well, I can't tell you the number, but it's massive. It's about like that. I haven't actually computed the number, but in the tropical rivers that flow north and that the world's largest intact savanna, which is what you have in northern Australia, it's a similar thing. It's the organizing principle in a sense of the landscape. And so we need to think about that. And we need to just acknowledge that that's part of what is going to keep our systems together. And I want to do a shout out to you in Australia in terms of where you are culturally on this stuff. This wonderful book, Linking Australia's Landscapes, that came out just last year, is as good a compendium as there is anywhere in the world on groping towards large landscape conservation. And the interesting thing about your culture is you're actually willing to analyze yourselves critically and not afraid to put it in print. So you actually read this, and this isn't all chest beating. It's actually, here's our challenges. It's actually a really good read. I recommend it highly. I wrote the foreword. But more importantly, it's really good. And you don't have a lot to learn because you're already pioneers in this field. And this wonderful document that called the National Wildlife Corridors Plan is about as good a compendium of the principles and the ideas of large landscape conservation and connectivity as exists anywhere. It's really thoughtfully done. It's a really good read, and I recommend it to you. It's a 2012 document called National Wildlife Corridors Plan for Australia. It's no longer the public policy of the national government, but the ideas it contains remain very, very robust. And if you want to kind of know how it works in Australia, you don't have to go any further than this document to find it. And this week, Bob Debus and I and Penny Figgis were all up in Darwin at a very special meeting of a fledgling idea called Kimberley to Cape. And what's interesting is we sometimes use these words, large landscape conservation or connectivity conservation. The world's landscapes are not all in the same condition. So if you look at this map here, this is the state of the world in terms of very heavily impacted by people through to pretty darn wild. And dark green is pretty darn wild. And pink is super heavily impacted. And what you can see is in a country like Australia, you actually have pink in Sydney, and then you've got pretty heavily impacted environments in the southern areas. This is no surprise, this is where all your people live, where all your farms are. It's no surprise. You can see the Ganges Plain in India, pretty busy. Europe, pretty busy. North America, you can see where the places have gone white, pretty busy. If you come into Australia again, you can see the north here is very, very, very green and very, very intact. And this is actually one of the wildest and most intact places in the world. The largest tropical savanna ecosystem in the world is in northern Australia. And it extends from Kimberley to Cape York. And so this week we were part of a workshop that developed a vision for that area, which is something like this: to ensure that the world's largest tropical savanna remains one of the world's great concentrations of biodiversity and retains vital Aboriginal cultures while supporting healthy communities from Kimberley to Cape York. And that, I believe, will start to roll out as an important idea in your culture. And what's special about those landscapes is you're actually not talking about connectivity so much as you're talking about having nodes of activity like a mine or a gas field or a concentration of farming in an essentially wild matrix. So the idea there is not to have corridors and connectivity, but to rather have the whole landscape intact with little nodes inside it. When you come into the Great Eastern Ranges, which is where 11 million people live, where an enormous part of Australia's biodiversity is concentrated, where you have several World Heritage Sites in the landscape, and the source of water for 11 million Australians comes off of that great watershed, you actually need to think about connectivity in a different way, which is connecting patches of habitat. And that's where the idea of connectivity conservation is most robust, is in a place like the Great Eastern Ranges, because you're trying to connect things. So you come down in your part of the world to the scale of, say, a koala. And a koala patch, in the Liverpool Plains there was a study done showing that koalas will go from a tree patch here, half a kilometer to a tree patch here, half a kilometer to a tree patch there across an open paddock. So you know something about that. So if you're trying to keep koalas in a landscape, you don't want to have your tree patches more separated than that, and ideally less so. And you have a wonderful, what we would call it a flying squirrel, but you of course have a more exotic name. It's called a squirrel glider. And he needs 40 meters to move around the landscape between patches. So you can soar 40 meters between patches. But that's probably, the world record holder, so you don't want your patches that far apart. But the point is, if you think about connectivity not only in terms of structural terms, like there is an unbroken canopy of trees, but in terms of what does nature need? What does a tree glider need? What does a koala need? What does whatever need? You can start thinking consciously about how we share the landscape with other species. And this is the magic thing, because there is no species that we don't need. And this book that was cited by Rob Stokes at the opening of this session, the Sound Colony Almanac, has one of the greatest quotes in ecology ever done, which is the first principle of intelligent tinkering is to keep all the pieces. So an extinction is a catastrophe, because none of us knows what role that rivet plays in the airplane. There are no species that are luxurious that we can spare. And the background levels of extinction are so low as to be irrelevant to our current condition, because we're having a species extinction bonanza right now. We must avoid extinction in our self-interest, not just the interest of species, not just in the interest of altruism, but in our self-interest. And if you think about the Great Eastern Ranges, this is the big concentration, the hotspot for Australian species. It's also the big concentration and the hotspot for the Australian human population. Those things are not disjunct. They are connected. And so something like the Great Eastern Ranges everywhere in the world needs to happen. But what you're doing with the Great Eastern Ranges here is not talking about it, you're doing it. You're figuring out how to do it. You're already getting measurable outcomes. There are subunits, things like Kosciuszko to coast, or summit to slope, where people are taking up pieces in between protected areas in the Great Eastern Ranges and trying to figure out what nature needs and piece it together. And then there's a community of land trusts. Some of you are in this room who are working with landowners on a voluntary basis to acquire interests or to buy parcels. Or some landowners, I'm sure, will actually step up of their own volition and do something that supports, say, a squirrel glider population. And that is where the magic is. Because you can do that voluntarily, you can do it through planned public process, you can do it a whole bunch of ways. But as long as you do it with nature's needs in mind, it can be variable across the landscape and the actors don't have to be uniform. And this is the really key thing about this. If it's a social project, it's not mine, it's ours. And you move out of the space of me into the space of we. And that also lets you get past antagonisms. And I want to give you a little story from the Yellowstone to Yukon region that I'm pretty happy with. We have big metallurgical coal mines or steel-making coal mines in the Canadian Rockies. The biggest steel-making coal producer in the world is Australia. The Elk Valley of British Columbia in the Canadian Rockies in the Yellowstone-Yukon corridor is the second largest producer of steel-making coal in the world. And this is not coal that's just used, brown coal, to make heat and power. It's actually part of making carbon steel. So it's a pretty valuable commodity. These mines sit athwart the Rockies and are between two World Heritage Sites, Waterton Glacier International Peace Park World Heritage Site and the Canadian Rockies World Heritage Site centered on Banff National Park. And in the past, there have been a lot of antagonisms between the coal mines and environmental community. A change of ownership in the coal mines and our ability to articulate what we wanted, as opposed to saying we want to get rid of the mines, we said we wanted to reconcile the world-class metallurgical coal values with the world-class wilderness, water quality, and wildlife values of this corridor between Waterton Glacier and Banff. And we've been able to find new common ground with this coal company, such that in the fall, they actually bought 3 super important parcels of land for $19 million that serve the agenda of connectivity in that landscape, including the most elusive parcel, the one that we believe is the single most important parcel for connectivity in the entire Yellowstone to Yukon corridor. And when they bought it, the CEO of the company said, we're interested in world-class mining and a world-class environment. And what's so exciting to me about that is that you can start to see a way that if we think about reconciling interests instead of who's right and who's wrong, that we can get to a new place. And we need to get to a new place. And one of the other things is somebody who's been very active in the environmental movement for 30 years, we've done something inadvertent that we need to get away from. Through the model we developed, we gave the impression that the environmental community was looking after the environment. And we're not. If we were doing such a good job, there wouldn't be 17,000 species on the IUCN Red List of risk of extinction. The environmental community is actually incapable of doing the job. We are a participant in doing the job, but it's society that has to do the job. And we have to get away from being the proprietors of the environment to participants, citizens in the world we want to live in. And that's one of the conceptual flips that I think large landscape conservation gives us, or connectivity conservation, or something like the Great Eastern Ranges gives us. It gives us a new space to get along with everybody in the service of something bigger than we could possibly achieve by ourselves. And if we make our metrics, what does nature need, not what do I want, or what are you doing wrong, but rather what can we do together to serve nature's needs, it becomes a nonpartisan thing. It becomes something right across the board that's in the public interest. And that surely is the sweet spot. And frankly, it's about what kind of world you want to live in. Do you want to live in a world where the rivets are popping, species are going extinct, and the challenge is, if you think about the mental pictures and things that we live in the world, this is what most people think is the image of the environment in the 21st century. Everybody knows this painting by Edvard Munch called The Scream. And this painting is one of the great paintings of the 20th century because it captures the angst of the time. And there are people wearing t-shirts of this all over the world. They have posters. Many young people have this up in their bedroom walls. And it's just this feeling is it's all going horribly badly. And it's actually enabled something called postmodernism, which is the idea that no ideas are good and you're all corrupt and you're all wrong, and I'm just going to do my own individual thing as an autonomous person. And this is a very scary time because some of the translation of that is young people check out, or young people only focus on themselves and don't believe in collective action anymore. We have got to shift away from a world where that is the environmental future. And every study, the Intergovernmental Panel on Climate Change study that came out basically says he's not screaming loud enough. He's not despairing loud enough because it's going really, really badly. And yet we know how to make it go less badly. And nature conservation not only deals with biodiversity loss, but there's 3 great drivers of human welfare that are at risk in the global environmental context. There's this wonderful paper by Rockström et al., a guy from Sweden, about the safe operating space for humanity and things like the ozone layer and productivity of soils and so on. And they identified 3 things that are out of whack now, that are creating risk for humanity. One is climate change. One is too much nitrogen in our rivers getting in, killing estuaries. And one is the loss of biodiversity. And the loss of biodiversity is the most serious of the 3. And what's interesting is if you prevent the loss of biodiversity and save nature, you actually improve the other 2 conditions. You improve the loss of the nitrogen leaching into systems, and you improve the climate. Brendan Mackey and I wrote a paper called The Nature of the Climate a few years ago, in which we talked about how nature protection is not only good for adaptation to climate change, it's also good to prevent climate change because it fixes carbon in the ground and keeps it in the ground. 1/5 of all emissions, more than all the automobile fleet of the entire world, comes from the destruction of wild nature. Did you know that? On an annual basis. It would be more effective if humanity stopped destroying wild ecosystems than if we stopped driving. Wow. We could do that. We could share the wealth enough to stop people from destroying nature. We could think about this together. Imagine if we cut emissions by 20% in the next 5 years. There isn't a climate plan in the world for that. Well, stop destroying nature. You're there. And then, the nitrogen issue is just too much fertilizer going into river systems, excess runoff from farms and stuff. If you buffer your river systems and stuff with nature reserves, less nitrogen will get to them, and if you can help work with people to think about applying an appropriate amount of nitrogen instead of excess nitrogen, we can get our estuaries back. So we can actually have a beautiful future. As nature is largely resilient, in a few places we've pushed it past rebound, like the cod fishery, unfortunately, off the east coast of Canada, which is one of those things that does make you want to scream. But so much of nature is still resilient enough to rebound if we give her a half a chance, if we think about her needs. And what's interesting is if we think about nature's needs, this is where we end up. The scale of nature needs half. And that's, in some places, it's an aspirational goal. Around Sydney, you're not going to be able to protect half of nature. That's really obvious. But you can do things to keep endangered species alive. We can do intensive management. But in a place like the Great Eastern Ranges, you can actually get to this scale of conservation and make a globally significant difference, as well as a difference in the lives and future of everyone here. And I'd like to see this become the painting of the 21st century, this sculpture. What's this? Okay. What's neat about it is a she-wolf, which is the absolute symbol of wildness, suckling the founders of Western civilization. Imagine if we lived like that again. The Great Eastern Ranges is a down payment on a good future for planet Earth. I'm so impressed that you're doing it. I'm so impressed that it's bipartisan. I'm so impressed that it continues to have energy. And I wish you all the very best in continuing to move it ahead, because it's good not just for Australia, but for the world. Thank you.